Ohio State did what the college football world expected them to do against Michigan State, murdering the Spartans in East Lansing by a score of 38-7. Ohio State's offense is back. I would say that's my number one broad takeaway. When Will Howard is throwing touchdowns on fourth down to G. Scott Jr., to Emeka Egbuka, when Jeremiah Smith is making one-handed catches and I think showing himself to be potentially the nation's number one wide receiver, when a Michigan State defensive line that has been getting pressure on quarterbacks all season long didn't sack Will Howard a single time, and when Travion Henderson and Quinshad Judkins are sprinting through holes no matter big, medium, or small, I think it's safe to say that this Ohio State offense is improved compared to last season's Ohio State Buckeyes offense. And last season's offense was not bad by any stretch. In fact, it was a good, great offense, just not up to the Ohio State standard. And seeing Chip Kelly calling plays is not a night and day difference from Day's play calling, but you can see that he has his own spark and his own ideas, and it just benefits everyone. Day gets to be the CEO, Chip Kelly gets to be the offensive coordinator. As for Michigan State, the broad takeaway I have for them is that Jonathan Smith is who I thought he was. He's an elite head coach. And if not for some boneheaded mistakes in this game, and if not for the fact that he's taking over a cupboard that was pretty barren, Mel Tucker did not do much good, if any, for the Spartans in East Lansing, Michigan State could have made this a football game. And early on, they were able to do things to Ohio State that I suspected they may be able to do, and they did that and more. So we're going to talk about this game and break it down here on College Football with Sam. But before we do that, I want you, yes, you, to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, share this video around to other college football fans who are passionate about the sport, who love it and are invested in it, who start watching games at noon and stay up past midnight like we do. Thank you so very much. And also join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. We talk college football 24/7 on there, and there are dedicated threads to all 18 Big Ten teams. So join the Discord server via that link. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, share this video around, comment your reaction to this game, and also watch this video all the way through. Those things support the channel big time, and the support we get is reinvested back into the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube. So the Buckeyes murdered Michigan State. We can get that out of the way. The statistics do reflect that. The Buckeyes averaged 6.4 yards per play against a Michigan State defense that I gotta say, I think is good. I think that they are a year away from being great. They have the pieces to be great. It's very similar to Michigan State's offense. It's just a new team that you can't fix everything that's broken in year one. It's the same story with USC's defense. It was the same story with Ohio State's defense in 2022 when Jim Knowles was hired in his first year. It's the same thing with many other teams as well across the nation. I think Ole Miss's offensive line showed that they can't be fixed in 1 year with them losing to Kentucky. And Ohio State's offensive line, what was impressive about their performance is they had struggles on the O-line last season. They returned a lot of guys. They brought back Justin Fry as their O-line coach. And Michigan State, with all their losses in the portal in the preseason, I still thought retained a good defensive line, and Ohio State did a very good job, not just in running the ball, but also in passing the football, and they averaged 0.507 points per singular play, about a half point per play. Some of that was due to Michigan State turnovers, some big plays, like a big play to Emeka Egbuka on fourth down, which went for a touchdown, some big catches by Jeremiah Smith, who we'll dedicate a few minutes to him in this show. And overall, again, just a well-rounded performance by Ohio State. Not perfect, but well-rounded and covering the spread on the road in their first Big Ten Conference game against a team that I think is competent in some ways is a good sign. For Michigan State, they averaged 4.9 yards per play. and they scored 0.13 points per play. Michigan State killed themselves with stupid turnovers, with a poorly executed QB sneak, where Childs tries to jump over the offensive line instead of trying to sink through it. Typically how QB sneaks are done. We've seen this with Will Howard. We've seen this with Drew Aller. We have seen it with Alex Orji, even at Michigan, and many other schools. When you're QB sneaking, you typically want to sink in with the offensive line and just gain that extra necessary yard. I don't know what Childs was doing, trying to jump over his offensive line and Ohio State's defensive line. But Ohio State's defensive line and defense is too disciplined to let something like that happen. Their weakness is more so due to scheme and maybe somewhat personnel up front. It has nothing to do with discipline. So I don't know what was going on there. Ohio State did a very good job of compensating for some mistakes by forcing turnovers, and MSU was not disciplined in that regard. So that's why you see, despite the fact that Michigan State was averaging an impressive amount of yards per play against Ohio State's defense, which is a little bit of a concern for the Buckeyes. Also got to give credit to Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren for some of the offensive success. Ultimately, they didn't get much points out of those big plays, out of those drives into Ohio State territory. And as for turnovers, Michigan State had 3, Ohio State had 1, which led to Michigan State's only touchdown. Both teams were pretty disciplined. Ohio State just had 4 penalties for 40 yards. Michigan State had 2 penalties for 19 yards. Overall, pretty clean game in the penalty department. Both teams did play hard. It was just Ohio State was the much better team. I want to get into some takeaways for the Spartans. Then, of course, we'll talk about the Buckeyes. You look at how Michigan State played in this game compared to any Mel Tucker performance against Ryan Day. Ryan Day and Mel Tucker, every time they met up, it was the same story. The same thing on repeat. 500 to 600 yards for Ohio State, the majority of them through the air, but also a lot of success on the ground, and Michigan State, outside of maybe one touchdown drive, couldn't get anything going. This year, it's different. It was different. The final score, the box score, may not say it was different, but it was. Ohio State only scored 3 points in the first quarter. They scored 21 points in the second quarter, but a lot of those were off of, I gotta be honest, elite execution by Ohio State, which is sustainable against Michigan State, but I don't know if, 2 touchdowns on 4th down are sustainable against a Penn State or Iowa defense, for example, if you get what I'm saying. The point I'm making to you all is that this game is way closer than the final score indicates. It was not close, but it wasn't a Ohio State cakewalk. This wasn't as if Ohio State just had a fluky pick 6 like they did in 2022 when C.J. Stroud and his receiver miscommunicated and Brantley had a pick 6 and Ohio State was only ahead by 8 points or something like that early on, and then they just coasted and it was kind of effortless and any points Michigan State had were kind of meaningless. That's not what this game was. Michigan State had the opportunity and enough momentum to make this a game, but they had turnovers. Ohio State forced those turnovers. Many of these turnovers, when watching, were not MSU just fumbling the ball or throwing it to the other team, though there were some pretty bad errors. But a lot of them were forced by Ohio State's defense, and you got to give credit there. It's a very well-coached defense. Jim Knowles is an elite defensive coordinator. But the Spartans were competitive in the first half, and that is impressive, and that's something to take note of. The fact that we're only in year 1 of the Jonathan Smith era, and this team is already better coached, especially on offense compared to prior seasons, and they function as a team. They do. The fact that Aiden Childs went 13 of 19 for 167 yards, a touchdown, a pick, 8.8 yards per pass attempt. He had -9 rushing yards. Ohio State did a pretty good job, more so later in the game than earlier, of getting to him. There were 5 Michigan State receivers with 2 receptions or more. Jaron Glover, Nick Marsh, Brennan Parachek, Jack Velling. All of those players averaged more than 10 yards per reception. Michigan State did something to Ohio State's secondary that I have not seen any team do since Michigan of last season. Effectively pass against Ohio State's defense, against the silver bullet secondary that may be the country's best. Take advantage of Ohio State's conservative scheme. Ohio State often was playing off Michigan State receivers early on, and Michigan State took advantage of that. It's good coaching, and they have good skill position talent. And on defense, Michigan State was making some good plays too. It's just when you have Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson and Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka and Will Howard, something I noticed immediately in this game was not the difference of trench size. Michigan State and Ohio State actually didn't look too different in the trenches. Ohio State had more depth, and yes, they were better in the trenches than Michigan State, but the most noticeable thing that I saw is Ohio State's wide receivers look like tight ends, and they look like linebackers and big, bulky safeties, except they're faster and more athletic than big, bulky safeties. And Michigan State's DBs are tiny compared to Ohio State's wide receivers. And the epitome of that was Jeremiah Smith's one-handed catches. Even in good coverage, Michigan State couldn't do anything on the perimeter. They couldn't do anything toward the boundary on their defense versus Ohio State's offense. And then looking at Michigan State's offense and Ohio State's defense, well, it was kind of a normal matchup there in terms of size. So Ohio State clearly had the athlete advantage, clearly. And then they also had the trench advantage as well. Michigan State's been banged up with some injuries. Ohio State's more experienced there, and they've recruited better there. So all of those things combined, Ohio State was just the better team everywhere. But to put 4 drives into Ohio State territory in the first half against a defense that was ranked number 1 by most power metrics entering week 5 and is still easily top 4 after this game, if not number 1, is very impressive. So kudos to Jonathan Smith, to Brian Lindgren, to Kayron Lynch-Adams, Nate Carter, and also Michigan State's offensive line early was able to create some holes, like some big holes. They were able to run the ball, and I thought that they were maybe getting a little too away from running the ball. I know that Ohio State's defensive front is intimidating. They're very good, near elite, maybe even elite, but running the ball more may have been a better idea, but that's really the only thing I can critique. And seeing how Michigan State had success in the passing game, maybe that's an unfair criticism from me even. Another thing to look at is how far away are the Spartans after this game? After competing with Boston College, after beating Maryland, beating FAU, beating Prairie View A&M, their schedule's very tough. That's for certain. But in all of their remaining games, outside of maybe Oregon on the road this coming Friday, I think Michigan State has a chance to win any of their remaining games. They won't win all of them. They don't even have the depth necessary to win all but 2 of their remaining games. They're probably going to lose at the very least 3 remaining games. They could even lose out. That's how bad the depth is. It isn't good. When you have that many new players, you're bound to have some issues. You just are. And Michigan State's dealt with a lot of injuries. They don't have the integrity at really any position outside of... No, they don't have the integrity at any position to sustain injuries and not have some type of major drop-off. For Ohio State, it's different. Ohio State could have one of their DBs tear his ACL and not much changes. It's the same thing, I think, with their defensive line. And with their wide receiver room, as long as it's not Jeremiah Smith getting injured, I think ceteris paribus. Things will remain constant. That's how good Ohio State is. That's how deep they are. Michigan State doesn't have anything close to that. But with another transfer class that will be incoming, with Jonathan Smith beginning to build on recruiting, with his foundations being in year 2, his coaching in year 2, his scheme in year 2 in 2025, how big of a jump will we see? And will it take just 1 year or 2 or 3 or maybe 4? Maybe it will take all the Mel Tucker recruits being fleshed out and all of Jonathan Smith's recruits taking up 100% of the roster for Michigan State to be good. How far away are they from being a good, great team, potentially a team that can compete for the playoffs, maybe even compete for the Big Ten? Because that's, I think, the long-term expectation with Jonathan Smith and Michigan State, that he builds them into some type of power. Maybe not a powerhouse, but a team that can compete with anyone in the Big Ten. Answer that down in the comments below, if you may. I think that looking at 199 passing yards, 8 yards per attempt, and then when you look at the ground game, factoring out the quarterback attempts because most of those are sacks, averaging 8 yards per pass attempt on Ohio State and then 3.5 yards per carry is indicative, I think, of not just good coaching, especially when you factor in that Jonathan Smith and Michigan State are only in year 1 of a rebuild. It's also, honestly, a compliment to their talent. Michigan State has talent, and they have young talent. Aiden Childs and Nick Marsh have several years left with Michigan State, and that applies to several other Michigan State players as well. And talk about the defense as well. Forcing Ohio State to be aggressive and go for it on 4th down, not dying through several quick scores. Ohio State's longest play, mind you, was 37 yards. And that was on the ground from Travion Henderson, who's one of the best backs in the country. Their longest reception allowed was 33 yards to Emeka Egbuka. They didn't allow any 2021, 2022, 2023 long bomb plays repeatedly. Ohio State just committed, well, assassination by 1,000 paper cuts. That's really how Ohio State won this game, and that's also a credit to them. Speaking of Ohio State's offense, I think that Jeremiah Smith is the nation's #1 wide receiver. And it may be an overreaction, but he got 2 one-handed catches where he mossed a defensive back who wasn't in poverty coverage, who was trying to cover Jeremiah Smith the best he can. And Jeremiah Smith and Ryan Williams, and to a lesser degree Nick Marsh, they've really come out of their locker rooms and their soul summer camp with their teams, and they're killing it. Absolutely killing it. And that's very refreshing because this year's quarterback class and wide receiver class I thought was going to be pretty weak. And I think that's somewhat panning out at quarterback. Wide receiver, though, you have 3 true freshmen. I don't know if I'd call Nick Marsh a stud, but 3 who've been very impressive, and Jeremiah Smith and Ryan Williams are studs. Ryan Williams is 17 years old. For context, I'm 21, about to turn 22. And he is doing phenomenal things on the field. Ryan Williams is. And also Jeremiah Smith. He had 5 receptions for 83 yards and a touchdown. And on the ground, well, he had a carry for 19 yards and a touchdown. He looks exactly like, and exactly, of course, isn't exactly, but he has the same alien capabilities that Garrett Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. do. He can run the ball on an end around with amazing acceleration, speed, and agility. He makes awesome contested catches. He gets open. He'll turn a slant into a touchdown again with the acceleration. Crazy body control where Devin Brown throws a pass that would be ahead of most receivers in a miss. He just, it's mine, touchdown. Phenomenal player. And I think he, if not the #1 wide receiver, is certainly a top 5, lock to be a top 10 wide receiver nationally. I can't even think of another wide receiver outside of, ironically, maybe Ryan Williams or maybe Travis Hunter, who is better than him. And I don't think they're better than him. I think that Ryan Williams benefits from a far superior system. He's almost as good as Jeremiah Smith. Maybe he's better, but I think Alabama's offense is way better than Ohio State's. I think it's better coached. I think that it's more creative. I think that they have also the much better quarterback and a better offensive line. And I think that that's the reason you're seeing Ryan Williams put up those humongous numbers. I mean, he's elite, but averaging over 20 yards per reception is something that I don't know how sustainable that is outside of an elite scheme like what Kalen DeBoer has ran and executed at Washington and is executing and running right now with Alabama. What Jeremiah Smith is doing is absolutely phenomenal. And again, 5 receptions, 83 yards, 16.6 yards per reception, and a touchdown. 1 run attempt, 19 yards, and a touchdown there. Just great playmaker. Obviously, he's not selfish, and you see that with the fact that Igbuka got the majority of the receptions, 7, 96 yards, and a touchdown. He plays with his team. And I think that he has all the qualities to be the next elite and legendary Ohio State wide receiver. You know, you don't want someone who is that talented but is a diva or who wants to be the center of everything. He's just playing with the team. He's just doing what is asked of him and then going far and away the extra mile to achieve it, the extra hundreds of miles to achieve it. I've been very impressed with him. Carnell Tate had a good game. We got to see Brandon Inniss get some action. This Ohio State receiver room just reloads year over year over year over year. And they're always going to as long as Brian Hartline is there and maybe beyond him. The last question I have, and you can answer this in the comments below, is Ohio State the nation's #1 team? S&P Plus would say they are. ESPN's FPI is tempted to say they are. I think there's an argument for it, which means consequentially I'm also tempted to say that Ohio State may be. And I'll start off by talking about some reasons why they aren't and some reasons why they are relative to this game. A reason why they aren't is the fact that they don't have the best trench play in the country. They may not even have the best trench play in the Big Ten. That may belong to Penn State after what they did to Illinois. And trench play is critical. It's a big part of the reason why Alabama was able to constrict and destroy Georgia early. Not just the fact that Alabama had this massive perimeter and skill position advantage, but they also did a very good job against Georgia in the trenches and were faster and stronger than them there. And they protected Jalen Milroe extremely well. Milroe also did a pretty good job of evading pressure himself. Texas, what they did to Michigan, I know they had a much better offense and better coaching and skill position play than Michigan, but they were equal to Michigan, if not a little bit stronger in the trenches than Michigan was. And you're seeing this pan out game over game over game. For the Longhorns, for the Crimson Tide, I don't think Georgia is bad in the trenches at all. I think, in fact, they are close to elite, and they're pretty banged up there right now. If they get back some of their players like Mykel Williams, and I don't know if Tate Ratledge will be back at any point this season, but if they were to somehow get him back, they would be elite in the trenches. I don't know if Ohio State has that yet, and part of it is the schedule. Another part of it is I've watched them against Marshall. I've watched them against Akron, against Western Michigan, and against Michigan State. And that's one of the weakest collections of a September schedule that has been played this year. And in no game except for the Western Michigan game did Ohio State really own in the trenches. They won in all 3 of those games, but they didn't own. They didn't, do what Michigan did in many of their 2021, 2022, and 2023 games in the trenches. Michigan has actually had some games this season where they've owned in the trenches, but their skill position play is so bad that it doesn't even matter. And at least Ohio State's not that. Their trenches are very good. But seeing what Michigan State was able to do early on, where, they're running the football fairly well, they protected Aiden Childs very well, and Michigan State's banged up on the offensive line, And seeing Ohio State's offensive line, where it seems as if Ohio State's rushing attack, it was better in this game, but early on it looked like some other games where it's big plays or just 2 or 3 yard gains and not much else. Work on that. Continue with what Ohio State had in the second half, where they were able to, in the second half, I think, dominate in the trenches and get more consistent gains and do a better job on the defensive line in particular. Because against Penn State, against maybe even Oregon, certainly against Texas, Alabama, and Georgia, I don't know how well that will work out. But that's really the only reason for them not being. The reason for them being is the fact that they put up 38 points and 483 yards without playing an A-plus game. Ohio State, if I'm being honest, probably played a C or B game relative to their talent, their potential, their coaching. And they still dominated, and that's a sign of an elite team. Ohio State is an elite team for this season, and I think that a sign that they're well coached, contrary to what some say, is they made second half adjustments. In fact, they made adjustments after the first quarter, after the first few drives, and they won 38-7. They covered the spread. They did better than many expected them to do, and they met the expectations of what it means to be an Ohio State football team, an Ohio State locker room, and they're 4-0. 1-0 in Big Ten Conference play, and up next is Iowa, and then Oregon. And I'll tell you that Ohio State has something that the rest of the college football world doesn't. If you factor out quarterback. If you take out quarterback, they have the best skill position talent in the nation by a mile. Best running back room, could have the nation's best wide receiver room. And at tight end, G. Scott Jr. was a little bit of a surprise to me in this game. I think he's taken big steps forward. The tight end room may be underrated relative to how people view Ohio State's tight end room. And the skill position talent is there. I mean, look at these numbers. 26 of 40 through the air, 298 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. On the ground, 35 run attempts for 185 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. It was a good game by Ohio State. Not a great game, not a perfect game, but a good game, and they still dominated. And that's indicative of a team who could be number one. That's indicative of a program that is contending and fighting for national championships. And my player of the game, last but not least, is wide receiver Jeremiah Smith. 5 receptions, 83 yards, a touchdown, 19 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. He's one of the best players in the entire country, and I think he's the best wide receiver. And he's only 18 years old. He's going to be with Ohio State for at least another 2 years, because you have to be in college for 3 years until you can go to the NFL. Maybe the NCAA will have some type of insane rule change like they've had in the previous half decade relative to restrictions on players or rules enforced on players, is maybe a better way of putting it. But he'll have to be in Columbus for the next 3 years, counting this one, and he's only going to get better. That's the crazier thing about it. So I'm rooting for Jeremiah Smith. I think anyone with a brain who enjoys college football should be rooting for Jeremiah Smith. And he's my MVP of the game. He's an elite player. And maybe he'll win the Biletnikoff Award. We'll have to see. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thank you to my Patreon members for sponsoring this video and channel, to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members, to Chris Lane, Honolulu OH, Ismar, Tyler Nye, and Chilton Cush for being All-American members, and John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being All-Conference members. Have a great day. Check out my Patreon page, merchandise store, and Discord server via the links in the description and down below in the pinned comment. See you guys very soon. Go Green and go Buckeyes.